Hey folks, this is Matt Miller from Ditch That Textbook, and I want to welcome you to the Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit, where we're talking to all sorts of great educators from all over about things like technology and pedagogy and all kinds of great topics that I know that you're going to be really interested in hearing. And I am so excited about having today's guest because I feel like this is a topic that we as educators don't know enough about, that could have a huge impact on what we do in the classroom. And so we're going to be talking all about cognitive science and specifically retrieval practice and other things with Pooja Agarwal. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Pretty close. Yeah. Okay. So Pooja, do you want to take a second and tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Hi, everyone. I'm Pooja. I am a cognitive scientist. I am also a teacher. I currently teach college students in higher ed at the Berklee College of Music. I'm not a musician. I teach cognitive science there. I am also a former K-12 teacher. I student taught in 4th and 5th grades in the St. Louis area. And I dabbled a little bit in ed policy, which was a lot of fun. And so I really enjoyed taking that background I have from K-12 and putting it to use as a cognitive scientist when it comes to both doing my own research and then really translating it and getting it into the hands of educators.
Yeah. And see, I think that's what's so important about what you do is that there's so much out there that we know these days regarding cognitive science. And there's been great advances in brain scans, and there's been so much research that's been published. And I just don't feel like very much of it has trickled down into the classroom. And I kind of feel like so often we have teachers that are giving kids advice on how they need to study and how they can learn and all of that. And so often what we do as teachers, even though we're very well-meaning and we want to give kids good advice, sometimes we don't give kids advice that's in line with what we know about how the brain works. So I guess the big question about all of this that I think maybe we can touch on is, can cognitive science help us in the classroom to work and learn smarter instead of just working harder?
The simple answer I would give is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this whole game to be.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Especially as a former K-12 teacher. I do think cognitive science and the current state of research and has a lot to say and a lot to contribute about how we teach and how students learn. There really has been this exciting, huge boom in this area of research in the past 15 years or so. And so I think it has a lot to offer instructionally and for students inside the classroom, outside the classroom. A lot of research even now has still been conducted in laboratories. So if you ever took an intro psych class or current college students who take intro psych classes, they get course credit to come into the lab or just really office space. We have them remember a bunch of stuff and then we have them spit it back out. And so a lot of lab research looks at a lot of that basic process. And there's starting to be more research that I and my colleagues have done in authentic K-12 classrooms. And so it's moving from that basic research to applied research that makes me very comfortable in giving the answer, yes, there's a lot we can offer as scientists to classroom instruction.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, I've even seen, I've seen a lot of this research, or at least some of it. I can't say a lot, but I've seen some of it anyway that is very applicable to the classroom that you've had your name on. For instance, I think I first saw some of your work in the book Make It Stick, where I think you said that a lot of the K-12 examples in there you had your hands on in some way, shape, or form with the research. And I remember reading that book and thinking, oh my goodness, there are instructional ideas and things that we can tell kids that could be so useful all throughout this book. And whenever I talk to teachers, it seems like so often I say, hey, have you heard of this book? Have you heard of any of these ideas? And they're like, no, what are you talking about? And it seems like, it just feels to me like this is kind of like education 101 stuff that teachers should know about.
Yeah. Yep. I
Yep.
agree.
Yeah. 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 So, okay. So let's dig into some things that we can share with educators that can be applicable into their classrooms. And I know a big passion of yours is this thing called retrieval practice, which I've dug into just a little bit, and I see the huge implications for it in the classroom. But it seems like so often educators just don't know very much about it. So can you start off just by telling us briefly what retrieval practice is and what it means for the classroom?
Thanks. I would say that retrieval practice is something pretty intuitive and something we do every day, which is just retrieving or bringing things to mind. Trying to remember, sort of trying to learn, but thinking about things in a way that brings them to mind so that we can practice and use it. So for me, it can be something as simple as thinking about what you had for breakfast yesterday. I'll give you a second to think about. Matt, do you remember, can you think about, retrieve what you had for breakfast yesterday?
Yep. I can retrieve that I had coffee and oatmeal for breakfast yesterday. I can remember that.
Great. I usually just have coffees.
Okay.
So that's retrieval. We do that all the time, right? When friends ask, what'd you do last weekend, or what are you going to do this evening? It's thinking about and bringing to mind something that was sort of in there. And when it comes to retrieval practice, especially in the context of student learning, it's this idea of, again, bringing information out. But as educators, what we often do is think about retrieval for assessment, is for our students to bring things out on exams, on projects, and that's the way that we assess how much they've learned. And what's different about retrieval practice is that there's research, both neuroscientifically and also in laboratory and applied settings, that act of bringing information out by kind of using it or losing it, using it helps improve student learning. So I like to give the analogy of sorts that we might often think about getting stuff into students' heads, and retrieval practice is this idea of getting things out of students' heads.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest, mind-blowing moment that I've heard when I've heard you talk, in interviews and different things like that, that we think so often about studying and about learning, and it's like, let's cram all of this information in, and we think of, okay, when the information comes out, that's the test. And so we're going to put all this information, it's like a bucket. It's like your mind's a bucket. You think of it that way. And it's like, how much stuff can I get in this bucket? And then when it's time for the test, I'm going to go pull the things out of the bucket. But what you're saying is that learning is a combination of both, kind of like, this is very crudely stated, but putting things into the mind and also taking it out, that can be part of the learning process, right?
Right. Yep. So an example, another example is whether or not you can retrieve, or if you remember or can pull out the information about at what age King Tut became a pharaoh. Do you happen to remember, Matt?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to say that I have a little bit of an advantage because I heard you ask this question on another interview. So, but the problem is that I still can't remember. I heard you give the answer and I still can't remember. And I remember that it was very, very young. I want to say he was like, the ages of 15 and of 6. And I know those aren't even close, but those are my two best guesses. Are either of those anywhere near the right answer?
Yeah, it's actually an average of 9.
Okay, all right. I was right. I was on either side of it. I'll take that. I'll consider that a win.
Yeah, so that's another example of retrieval. Now, if you had maybe had what we can talk about spaced retrieval, if I had asked you a week after, that was the podcast, I think, with Jennifer Gonzalez on cult of pedagogy. If I had asked you a week later, at what age was King Tut when he became pharaoh, then that would have helped this retrieval process. But what you just did, I'm pretty sure you're going to remember his age a week or a month from now.
I hope so anyway. We'll see. I hope so.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Okay. So, and maybe we can touch a little bit more on this Well, you know what? I want to come back to spaced retrieval. You just kind of touched on that at the end, but um, let's talk about this idea of retrieval practice in the context of the classroom. So it's powerful. And no, you know what? I keep like rearranging all of my questions in my brain here. I want to get to the context of the classroom, but there's I wrote a little bit about retrieval practice in my book, Ditch That Homework. And I remember reading in one of the studies, there was one by Jeffrey Karpicki and Janelle Blunt that talked about retrieval practice. And one of the things that amazed me about that was at one point in the study, they said that they asked their participants if they thought it was going to work. Like they asked, because they were doing a comparison between retrieval practice and I think it was elaboration or some other strategy, something where they were making, like, I don't know, kind of like word webs or I don't know. There was something that they were doing. And they said, between these two, which one do you think will work? And only like 25% of the respondents thought that retrieval practice was going to be the most effective. So I wonder if we're having this battle of, is it intuitive and do people think that it will actually work? Do you think that there's something to that?
Yeah, so in that study with my colleagues Jeff Karpicki and Janelle Blunt, they were looking at what they also called an elaborative activity. They referred to it as concept mapping, which teachers may sometimes use in the classroom or students may use it as a study strategy. And they looked at retrieval practice where students read a passage and then closed the book and wrote everything down they could remember, versus while reading the passage, they wrote out these word webs or concept maps. And something we see time and time again is that students predict that the easier initial learning strategies will lead to the most amount of long-term learning. So what seems easy now, I seem like I really know it now, means I'm really going to know it a week from now or a month from now. Another example we see all the time in research is when we have students reread over and over again, and we ask them how much you're going to remember in a week versus students who did retrieval practice. They took a quick quiz, for instance, and students who reread over and over again predict more learning in the long term than students who engage in retrieval practice. And one reason that this happens is because what seems challenging seems like it's not working. And we know as educators and as students that cramming works, rereading works for an exam the very next morning. And so students develop this feeling of what we call the illusion of fluency or the illusion of competency. That, oh yeah, I reread this stuff, I did this concept map while studying, it was super easy, so I know this stuff and I'm gonna remember it. As opposed to more challenging activities like retrieval practice that are actually more beneficial for learning. So in some ways for students, it can seem very unintuitive. I don't know if that's a word. They don't seem to understand, or it's difficult to change their perception that what's challenging is actually a good thing. And a colleague of mine, Bob Bjork, coined this term in the 90s, desirable difficulty. That retrieval is a desirable difficulty. It's a good thing for our learning.
Yeah, yeah. I know I've fallen into that same pit of, if it feels like it's working, then I assume that it will produce long-term learning. And I even remember, I think and that was another one of my aha moments when I read Make It Stick, is that if students struggle with, it's just like what you were saying, if students struggle with learning something, that it seems to produce more long-term learning. I may have butchered that, but that's kind of the takeaway that I got from that. So, okay. Sorry, go ahead.
One thing I'd like to mention, of course, so we know that students do this, so how can we actually change it and improve it? I'd say would be the next step. And this disconnect between what they think will help them and what actually helps them is what we call metacognition. So thinking about your own thinking, or students who know what they know and then also know what they don't know. And in order to develop this awareness of our own learning, feedback is a critical component. So there's been a lot of research on the importance of feedback after retrieval. So, gee, I thought about the age that King Tut became pharaoh. I guessed 6 or 15. So I need that feedback. But now I know that that's something I need to study more. If we hadn't engaged in that retrieval process, you might have assumed, you know, kind of like you mentioned, oh, I know that because I heard it on the podcast.
Right, exactly.
So that's actually a perfect example where that disconnect happens, but now that we've had that feedback, now that corrects that misconception. So a lot of work on that has been done by my colleague Andrew Butler on looking at what type of feedback, how often, how close to retrieval, which I'm happy to get into or to send more resources.
Oh, I'm fascinated by that. I know it's like we've got a lot of kind of like basic things that we could discuss here, but that's something that I know I'm fascinated about. In fact, I can already kind of like imagine a future blog post where we could kind of dig into all of that. So if you're watching this video, stay tuned on Ditch That Textbook. We may be able to get into some of this that we can't get into today. So, okay. So the other question I was going to come back to, let's come back to that now. And I think we've touched on this a little bit to this point, but how can this idea of retrieval practice actually fit into the classroom setting? Like, what are some practical, I can use this tomorrow, or I can start putting this into my lesson plans type of things that teachers can do to start to reap the rewards of it?
I would, I guess one of my favorite examples is what I call, or there are lots of names that you could use, but I call them brain dumps. So to ask students to, again, close their books, make sure they don't have notes. I've done research on open book versus closed book types of retrieval. To close their notes and to just write down everything they can remember, or even write down 2 things they can remember. And then either open the book back up, check and see how they did, give themselves feedback, or as teachers to give some classroom discussion or think, pair, share. But that act of kind of dumping out things from your brain helps emphasize that retrieval is a learning strategy, that dumping of things out of your brain is not an assessment. And on top of that, brain dumps also provide formative assessment in addition to retrieval, because then as instructors and teachers, we know how our students are doing, but we also know that that's a good learning strategy. And actually a lot of laboratory research, including the one you mentioned by Jeff Karpicki and Janelle Blunt, does exactly that. Students read passages and then they literally write down everything they could remember. And so we know from laboratory research, from K-12 research I've done with a collaborator of mine, Patrice Spain in Illinois, that simply writing down what you can remember or 1 or 2 things, and then, well, just doing that can help. And then providing that feedback, if you have class time, it can be as simple as 1 minute, or think, pair, share, can really help student learning. So I like that. It's simple. It takes less than 1 minute. You can do it tomorrow.
Okay. So kind of a follow-up question to this. So if we talk about the idea of the brain dump, which I think is great, what if students like create something out of that to kind of like make meaning? So I don't know if it could be, it's kind of like this goes back in my mind to the elaboration thing we were just talking about earlier about, maybe creating a chart or making something that, an infographic, or, there's that idea of creating in the classroom, of making things instead of just, doing worksheets and, different things like that. There's this big push. And does that fit in with anything that we've been talking about to this point?
That's a great question, because I can't think of research, at least not right now off the top of my head, I can't think of research of that next step, which is incredibly valuable instructionally, right? So students have brain dumped all this stuff, what's next? And at least in terms of research, that then helps build for future lessons. But creating projects out of it is something that, as experts in education, I mean, I'd love your strategies to share with me about what that might look like. The only thing that comes to mind is something that, again, my collaborator, Patrice Bain, she's a 6th grade social studies teacher. What she does is she has students do a brain dump at the beginning of a unit. So let's say students are learning about ancient Egypt, and she has them at the very beginning write down, what do you know about ancient Egypt? And students may come up with 5 things, 10 things, 1 thing. And then at the very end of the unit, about a month later, she'll have them do the same thing. And students will write down everything they can remember. And then she gives them both, so that students can really see their own progress from the beginning of the unit to the end of the unit. So that's a little bit different from building, taking a brain dump onto something next. But I do think that kind of pre-post feedback for students, not as an assessment, but for students, can be really important.
And I would think that that's got to be great motivation too. I mean, to be able to look back and to see how far that you've come. I think that sometimes as teachers, we forget about that, to show kids how far they've come. That's one thing I love about blogs, for example. If students write in blogs, that it's very easy to go back to the beginning of the year and to see, oh man, this is the way that my writing looked at the beginning of the year. And now look at it today and see how far that, you know, I've come. And, oh man, I was doing these. I do that with my own blog. I'll look back at some of my own blog posts. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I actually did that. And then I'll come back to today, and I'm sure that today's writing will look totally rotten compared to the way it looks in future years. But yeah, there's that whole reflection piece that I think is so important. And you know, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I've found for myself that that doing sketchnoting, like visual note taking, is huge for me, and being able to remember what I've learned. And so I could even see sketchnoting can take different forms. Sometimes people live sketchnote like a speech or a video or something. They'll jot down and put little pictures next to it and make charts and make connections and all that while people are talking. But then you can also do it after the fact, where you've gathered some information and now you're going to make meaning of it, and you're going to kind of like chart it all out in these visual notes. And I wondered if, because I know there's power in, what do they call it? Dual coding theory, where, you know, you have the verbal and the visual. And if you can pair those two together, that's strong. So it just would make sense to me. I don't know. I'm just kind of putting this stuff together, for myself, that if we have that and we have the power of retrieval, that if you could kind of put those two things together, that would seem to me to be a more brain friendly way of, or at least a different way anyway, of learning. I don't know. I'm just coming up with this stuff.
Yeah. I think an important component of note taking is to make sure that retrieval is included. So there's plenty of research I'm happy to share about how note-taking is actually a very ineffective study strategy for students. Typically, they'll take notes with, and you can imagine, especially with college students, they take notes while reading their textbook, and they may or may not go back through them. Students will take notes during classroom lectures. There has been research that taking notes on laptops is even more ineffective, because students can type so fast that they just literally transcribe what the professor is saying. And whether or not students go back to review their notes, again, that's not retrieval. That's just rereading a shortened version of what you originally read or what you watched in lecture. And so I think a good way to build on maybe visual sketch notes is to take those notes, but then again, in this idea of spaced retrieval, which is simply to revisit or come back to it, is to maybe try visually sketchnoting what you can remember. I'm making this up too, but visually sketchnoting what you can remember that you did the first time.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense to, we obviously are kind of like coming up with this on the fly, I guess, not like research based or anything, but it makes sense in my brain anyway. I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
So,
well, I do. There may not be specific research to that, or at least I can try to dig some up for a future blog post. But any retrieval, I'm pretty confident in saying any retrieval involved is going to boost learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so, now that we've touched on this idea of spaced retrieval a couple of times, I wondered if we could talk about that more specifically? And are there any sort of like best practices for how to do it? Like, certain number of minutes or hours or days, if there's anything to that. If there's, basically anything that we can use as teachers to optimize the way that we bring things back up so that we're, kind of like continually calling those to mind, continually having to, pull those out of our memory.
Yeah, there's, in terms of, I'll back up and just give one or two examples about spacing and then talk about kind of the optimal spacing and maximizing it. The idea of spacing, again, I think is pretty intuitive, that we as educators may do already, is to, in some ways, revisit content over the course of a semester, over the course of a year. So maybe projects that are cumulative at the end of the year that involve revisiting stuff students have learned previously in the year. A key component, and so there has been research that spaced rereading is beneficial for learning, but that spaced retrieval is even more beneficial. So when we have research where students reread, but it's kind of crammed rereading for 5 hours straight versus spaced rereading 1 hour for 5 days, that spaced rereading is more beneficial for learning. But when you combine spacing with retrieval, it's even more beneficial. In terms of, so spiraling might be an example, spiraled curriculum, where you're kind of returning back to things. But an important component, again, is involving retrieval. So not just saying, hey, remember a month ago we talked about Boston and the American Revolution. A difference might be to ask students, hey, what did we talk about a month ago? Right? So you're building in spacing by asking about previous things, but you're retrieving instead of asking students to, instead of we as educators just reviewing it.
Right.
Another way more simple example is, of course, a common question we ask as educators or parents is, hey, what'd you learn today at school? And a very simple example would be, well, what did you learn yesterday at school? And that's that very simple switch to yesterday, based on research, again, in labs and applied settings, has been shown to improve learning.
Okay, so now it's not just what did you learn just immediately today, but can you go back to yesterday and, retrieve, remember whatever it is that you learned yesterday? That's interesting for me as a parent. That's a question that I ask my kids all the time. How was school? What did you do at school? But and of course, as parents, we all battle the monosyllabic, one syllable answer. If it's even a word, sometimes it's just a mumble, like an one of those things. And this seems like this is another step that we can take to improve on that. Is not just what did you learn at school today, but what did you learn at school yesterday? And then we're getting into that spacing, right?
Yeah. And it might actually provide a challenge in a good way for students or for your kids, not just in a retrieval spacing kind of way, but maybe motivationally. I do think kids like challenges. And so if a kid has to take a minute to think, what did I do at school yesterday? I wonder if that could be a lot more fun and get away from those monosyllabic responses of nothing,
Right. Yeah.
This benefit. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. Or it could be, that makes my brain hurt when I have to think about that. So,
yeah. I saw it at a conference I just attended where someone had written down, how often do we make our students think hard?
Right. Yeah, that's a very valid question. Yeah, absolutely. And we talk so often in education about rigor. Rigor is one of these things that people are very hot or cold about, and sometimes people think that rigor is more questions, but I don't think it's really so much. Are we asking more questions? Are we doing more problems? Are we doing more assignments? It's the depth of the thinking. So that ties perfectly back to what you were saying. How how often do we get kids to think? What was the word that you used? How often do we get kids to think? Was like deeply or something like that. So yeah, I totally agree with that. That's great. So getting back into the classroom with this, I know I've read in some of your stuff that flashcards can actually play a role in retrieval practice too, which is funny because sometimes we look at some of these things that people have done for years and years and years and years, like flashcards, and we think, oh man, that's probably some antiquated practice that we can do so much better at these days. But that's one of those things that still can have relevance in learning, right?
Yeah. Yes. Flashcards may seem antiquated, but as long as they still involve retrieval, then there's lots of research, again, by Jeff Karpicki in particular, that flashcards can help. One of the challenges with flashcards is that students, and this ties into what we were talking about in terms of how well students can evaluate their own progress in learning, students tend to drop their flashcards too quickly.
Oh, I've heard you talk about this. Yeah. Please go into this. This is great.
Yeah. So if you're looking at a flashcard, again, I'll keep using the same example of King Tut, because now you're going to remember it, Matt. If you're the front,
he was 9 years old. 9.
And well, that's the cool thing about flashcards is research by Jeff and others demonstrates that trying to retrieve successfully, ideally about 3 times, is more powerful to then drop your card, as opposed to if you retrieve it once and you go, oh yeah, I knew that, and then you drop the card. And students don't stick with it a few more times because, again, they make these metacognitive judgments where obviously I know it, I got it correct, and so I drop it out and I never come back to it. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of great research that ties in about feedback, and we can imagine how just because a student got something correct, whether it's on flashcards or a quick quiz in class or an exam, just because a student got something correct doesn't mean they know it. They could have just been guessing.
That's true. That's a good point, yeah.
And so I encourage with flashcards to make sure that students aren't cheating themselves. They're not looking at a flashcard and assuming or thinking, yep, got that correct, and then never coming back to it. So flashcards are great for retrieval, but there's research on how to make it even more powerful for student learning.
Yeah, definitely. And maybe we can take a shift real quick into some digital versions of this too, because I know that, for instance, Kahoot has taken the education world by storm, and there are some similarities to what we're talking about here with flashcards and what you do in Kahoot. I also know there's the old standard tried and true site called Quizlet, where you can make your own flashcards and you can go through and play them, but it will also test you. There's a variety of little activities. There are even some games that you can play. And even now, there's a really neat newer feature called Quizlet Live, where they'll take students and put them into groups of 3 or so, and they'll pull about 12 flashcards or so out of the flashcard deck, and they'll give each of those 3 students 4 answers, and then they have to work together as a small group to try to figure out who has the correct answer to that question. So even there's some retrieval in that, along with some teamwork and collaboration and problem solving and all of that. So I wondered, with what about retrieval and whether flashcards play into this or not, how does our practice with using tools kind of like that, how does that play into the research that you know?
There is some research that, where do I start? There's research that me and my collaborators like Roddy Roediger and Mark McDaniel, authors of Make It Stick that you mentioned, and Kathleen McDermott, all at Washington University, and again, Patrice Bain, the 6th grade teacher, where we used, I don't know if it's antiquated at this point, we used a website called Kia. Does anyone use Kia?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I think, teachers still use that.
Okay. So we used Kia, where instead of a lot of our research in Patrice's class and classes in her district, we use clicker quizzes. But we did do a project where we looked at Kia, where we put essentially all the clicker quiz material onto Kia. And we told students, look, quiz yourself outside of class. We're not going to enforce how often. Some students may or may not have had access to the internet or a computer, but go online, use Kia when you can, and come back. And when we looked at their learning at the end of the unit, even then we saw benefits for learning when students used Kia versus when material wasn't on Kia. And so in that way, it was encouraging. Granted, it was just one experiment, but with a few hundred students in 6th grade, it's just one experiment, but shows that even when students are given the autonomy to quiz themselves outside of class, you can see big benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah, to my knowledge, most of the research on online quizzing, and especially student quizzing with flashcards or games, has been done in college and medical school experiments. So you can imagine there, or you've probably heard of lots of these flashcards apps popping up about how students can quiz themselves, especially in medical school, because they have so much to remember. And I know that there's research demonstrating that that works as well. One thing that people in my field are looking at is how are those flashcard apps being built? So for instance, they may involve retrieval, but similar to student flashcards, how can we make them even more powerful? Because they may drop items too fast in those apps as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but again, coming back to the idea that as long as students are remembering and they're not cheating themselves by looking at the answers or anything like that, it does boost learning.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I think that definitely helps. And that's obviously something that's actionable in the classroom, that we can use. So that's good. Let's see. What else can we talk about related to retrieval, or even, I mean, just anything else, cognitive science? I've got a couple of other things here, but I don't want to manipulate the conversation too much.
Yeah, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
So I know that you just wrote Ditch That Homework. And I frequently, when I talk with K-12 teachers, I frequently get questions about how to keep it low stakes, because again, we want to make sure that retrieval emphasizes as using it instructionally as a learning strategy, not an assessment strategy. So I get questions about grading a lot, but then I get questions about homework. So how is retrieval different from homework, whether it's inside the classroom or outside? You wrote about this stuff in your book. I'd love your perspective on how might it be different, and how can we as scientists think about it, and how can educators think about it?
Yeah, I think the point that you make about it being low stakes and are we using it for assessment or not is key, because, you know, I think just giving kids the opportunity to know about some of these strategies, and how, you know, how sometimes just knowing that if you can retrieve it out of your brain in your own words, that's useful. You know, just empowering them with that. I think that's something that they can pull into their entire lives, you know. And if we were able to do assignments that were less, I'm going to collect it the next day and I'm going to grade it, and the percentage of incorrect answers is going to drive your grade, versus we're going to do this and this is going to help you learn, and, you know, this is a learning activity instead of an assessment that's going to have a grade tied to it. You know, I think there's something there that can be really useful. I don't know. I mean, you know, I sometimes I kind of feel like just the knowledge of how this works and putting it in the hands of kids can be just as powerful as anything. That's kind of like the first place that my brain goes on that, I suppose.
Yeah. Oh, neat.
Yeah, yeah. So, and can we touch on what you just said there about the low stakes nature of using retrieval? Because, you know, kind of like what I was just saying a second ago, it's so easy for us as teachers to think that when you pull it out of your brain and you put it onto a paper that I need to take a grade for it. But that act can be done almost like quizzing yourself, can be done as a learning activity instead of as an assessment opportunity, or at least one that's tied to a grade, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's, there are, I'm fascinated by this idea of retrieval inside the classroom versus outside the classroom. So how we think about what we had for breakfast versus inside the classroom when we think about who the fourth president of the United States was. There's this cringe feeling, right? That I find really interesting. And I think it ties into all of this again, because we're so used to thinking about retrieval as being an assessment process. At the same time, I think, again, as educators, we do include retrieval in our classrooms, like entry and exit tickets are a great example, where those may be low stakes or no stakes. They're great instructionally, so students come into the classroom and already have a do now or an entry ticket. And if those aren't graded, or they're just used for attendance or something like that, and again, they're emphasized as a learning strategy, this helps us learn. This challenge makes us think hard, and that's going to make things much easier and better for us down the road. When we can come up with strategies that demystify within our classrooms, across our classrooms in our schools, that retrieval isn't for assessment. And I know growing up, I played Jeopardy, or, you know, had those kind of competitive games as a student in my K-12 experience. And Jeopardy can be a good retrieval strategy, but I also worry that that has some social high stakes, right? You don't want to mess up in front of other pods in your class.
Oh
You
yeah.
don't,
Yeah. And especially with some of the tools that we have these days, you know, like the Quizlet Live that I was talking about, you're in a group of 3. And so there are some of those social factors that play into it. Like, do you have one dominant person who takes control and answers all of the questions over the other ones? Or, you know, what if you get paired up with somebody else and then there's that anxiety? I know as a foreign language teacher, we call that the affective filter, you know, where you start to have all of those emotions that start to cloud your thinking, and you're not thinking as clearly. And yeah, there's some of those issues that I think play into that don't let us use our full cognitive faculties. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah. I love the phrase effective, what did you call it? Effective filter?
The affective filter, yeah, with an A at the beginning. The
Yeah.
affective filter, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, cold calling on an individual student, right, I think ups that uncomfortable aspect of retrieval.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge fan of giving students 2 seconds, 5 minutes, depending on the lesson, to think individually. And as opposed to cold calling, we've done some research on this in K-12 as well, that cold calling on students or putting them on the hook may mean that other students aren't retrieving. They just take a big sigh and think, oh, great, Matt got called on. So now I don't have to think of the answer, right? And I think making those small adjustments can contribute to the low stakes, no stakes retrieval as an activity.
Yeah.
And again, as opposed to me as an educator standing and telling students what we did yesterday.
Yeah. You know, that even makes me think of there's an activity that I've done in the classroom where I'll use a Today's Meet chat room. If you're not familiar with Today's Meet, it's basically, I mean, it's kind of what it sounds like. It's almost like a private chat room that you set up for you and your students. And you put in what they call your nickname. That's like your screen name. And then you can type messages into it. And a lot of it was built, I think, for swapping messages back and forth. But I would use it as a quick formative assessment tool. And in that case, sometimes I would tell students, I'd say, don't put your name in as the nickname. Put in a number, put in a letter, put in a smiley face, you know, something like that, so that they're anonymous. But then you're able to ask them that question. They're able to put it out there, and you as this teacher get the results, but there's not that social play into it where you're worried about your name going up on the screen and everybody sees that you were the one who got that answer wrong. And so that way you're able to still do I didn't even realize I was doing it at the time, but you're able to get that retrieval practice. The teacher's able to get that immediate instant feedback. And then if there are lots of kids that don't get it, that gives them an opportunity to go into that quick reteach. Let's do a quick mini lesson on this before we move on. And it sounds like that plays together well with the research you've done on retrieval.
Yeah, and actually that's something I've been trying to toy around with, how I can do some similar activities with my own classes with college students, and I teach intro psychology right now. And I love that idea of both the intro chat, but the anonymous aspect. I hadn't thought about that. I was thinking of having like a Twitter feed that me and my class could use, but the anonymous part I really like. So thanks.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that.
And there are several tools that I think will let you do that. And so, yeah, I don't know, we may have to like chat about this, about how we can pull some of these technology things together with the, the cognitive science and, rule the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Well, let's start to wrap this up a little bit. We're starting to run out of time. I know that, whenever I work with teachers, a lot of times we talk about things that you can use in your classroom, new practices, new activity ideas and everything. And I feel like when I just talk about here's some neat things that you can use, it makes me think of that old proverb of if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for the day. But if you teach him to fish, then he'll eat for a lifetime. And I feel like if we talk about what's coming out in research and cognitive science right now, we're just giving them fish. So let's teach them to fish a little bit and get them connected to the pipeline of new ideas. So where are some places that teachers can go to keep up with all of this so that, once they're done with this video, this isn't the sum total of everything related to retrieval practice and cognitive science that they get? Where are some places that they can go?
So of course I have to self-promote, but I do think it's a valuable resource.
And I don't think it's self-promotion if I'm asking you to do this. So in all honesty here, before we came on, I basically asked Pooja to talk about this site because this is one that I check on myself on a regular basis. I'm subscribed to her email newsletter. I love the stuff that she's putting out. So this isn't really self-promotion. I should have said this before we even brought this up, but this isn't self-promotion if I'm begging her to do it. So yes, please talk about retrievalpractice.org.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so retrievalpractice.org is a website that I created, and it's, I guess, 2 or 3 things that make me really excited about it. So one, it's all content that's been curated. So I do send out these email updates. I encourage you to sign up for them. They're weekly. They're sent by me. I don't sell your email addresses. And I curate content from other scientists, which is important to me. There's great research out there, and it's trickling into education, but it needs more of that trickling, right? We need to teach everyone to fish. And so I curate content and provide research that you can click on to learn more about cognitive scientists in the field. Another thing is that retrievalpractice.org is specific to educators. Of course, there's a lot of ways that all of this cognitive science research can be applied for students and student study strategies. I'm really passionate about the impact educators can make, so it's also specific to educators. And then I think the third specific approach is that it's specific to this area of learning and memory research that me and my collaborators have done. So if you go on retrievalpractice.org, you can see a list of all of the major experts in this field. You can see a list of education experts that you can link to and learn more, so you can keep going with this in addition to just my weekly emails. So there's a link to Matt as a collaborator. Jennifer Gonzalez frequently has podcasts or articles about this kind of research. The Learning Scientists is another group of collaborators of mine who are also at Washington University with me. They do really fantastic work on translating all of this stuff for a broad audience. And so you can also get links to other resources from there. I also have downloadable guides, which I hope they're free. I hope they're helpful for PD in particular. I want to teach people how to fish, right? I love that analogy. So you can download these guides, take them with you, print them, share them. And so I hope it's a helpful resource.
Yeah. Oh, I think it definitely is. In fact, I think if anybody's watching here and you go to retrievalpractice.org and take a look at some of Pooja's guides, you will hear that some of the things that I've talked about, the things that I've asked her about or have mentioned will come straight out of those guides because that's where I learned about it. So, the whole idea of talking about flashcards earlier basically came because I saw that in one of her guides. So, so that's great. And then like you said, the collaborators that are on there. I mean, I like to dig into, I think the learning scientists are great. And, you know, I think they've got a really good resource and really good ideas out on their site too. So there's some really good ones. And if you don't subscribe to the retrievalpractice.org emails, I think you're missing out, because there was one that they just recently, as of the recording of this video, that Pooja just recently sent out, where she said, here are 2 things that have been published recently where we don't even have the full text of it. We just have the abstract, and it can impact how you teach in the classroom. And these are the things where none of us in education would have gotten any inkling of this, but because she's paying attention and she's telling us, those are the things that we're able to get access to. So I think that, that email newsletter is definitely a huge, huge resource that if you're not subscribed to it, I think that you're missing out. So, so definitely go check that out. So. All right, wonderful. This has been great. And I think we've got lots of practical, actionable things that teachers could put into their classrooms, and a little better understanding of retrieval practice. So Pooja, thank you again so much. And if again, if you're not checking out her resources there, if you're on the Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit site, if you're on her page, down below the video, there are links to lots of her resources. So again, Pooja, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.